Guild Wars 2 has announced they are working on a brand spanking new expansion, exploring the Dragon Continent, more commonly known as Cantha. Yes, happy dance. Okay, so yes, today we are looking at factions released way back in April 2006, the original Guild Wars Canthan Expansion. Specifically, we will be immersing ourselves in the old locations and warring clans of the Luxon and the Kurzicks that dominated much of the continent back in the day. If you're more interested in the story, links in the top right hand corner of the screen to my lore breakdown for factions, because here in this video we'll be focusing on the old explorable areas of factions and indulging in some speculation about elite specializations, gear that might possibly be born of it, and of course perhaps a new playable race that could be born from the fertile land of Cantha itself. Okay, so to help you navigate this long video, there are timestamps below so you can jump to the parts you're interested in, and links to the Guild Wars wikis for all the locations, characters, odds and ends discussed here. So let's jump into it, starting with the Dragon Continent itself and the human Empire of the Dragon, which we explored in factions, giving you a not so TLDR guide of the area's history, aesthetic and people of the lands. So where in the world is the Dragon Continent of Cantha? Well, Cantha lays far to the south of Olona, across the Clashing Sea. The closest inhabitable island grouping is the Battle Isles, actually, which was a PvP hub from Prophecies, the first ever Guild Wars game, which, due to its relative proximity, well, it might find its way back into the game. PvP is having a new hub outside the Mist. That might be awesome, but technically this was not part of the Canthan Expansion. I mention it for proximity to the Dragon Continent. Now, Cantha boasted 4 main explorable areas: Shing Jea Island, Kaineng City, Echovald Forest and the Jade Sea. The ethos and aesthetic of factions was based primarily around a kind of an amalgamation of ancient South Asian cultures. So the Canthan continent was once home to dragonkind, hence the lesser-known name, and why the first emperor named his empire after dragons. Now, dragons of all aspects lived there on Cantha of ancient times, and perhaps still do. But what influence the elder dragons had over these lands in those dark ages of prehistory is unknown. But as is the nature of sentient beings, and they are very well that, it is profoundly unlikely that dragonkind was a monolith. So we see in Glint, Vlast and Aurene both the capacity for altruism possessed by these enigmatic creatures, and the pernicious influence the elder dragons can wield over their own kind. Going forward, I hope the narrative team will explore the origins of this species, including the elder dragons. We have been dealing with these big bads for 7 years now, and I think it is long overdue for us to truly understand the nature and evolution of these extraordinary beings, and what better place to do that than their home continent. Back to the humans. So when the human gods arrived on Tyria in 768 before Exodus, it was on the Canthan continent, and then 276 years later, the Empire of the Dragon was born, founded by King Canthan warlord who united the disparate clans of humanity. Ascending to power, King took the mantle of Kaineng, and the capital city of that nation still carries his name, or did carry its name anyway. I will dive into a Canthan history of humanity in the story breakdown above in my head, but for our purposes here, all you need to know is that the imperial line of succession was unbroken from King to the current events of faction. Culturally, although Cantha traded with other human nations at times, the empire was often furiously isolationist, and travel to the realm was vanishingly rare. Most foreign traders were only ever granted access to the Situng harbour, located off the west coast of the mainland Cantha, although there is a port on the mainland in Kaineng City in-game, which connects players to the other campaigns. Players who created faction characters began life the large, mountainous, fertile isle of Shing Jea, which was the bread basket of the empire following the Jade Winds, and also served as the scholastic and spiritual nexus dedicated to the worship of the old gods and the study of all the heroic professions. The beautiful Shing Jea Monastery was the main player hub. The Ranmusu Gardens were used by the priesthood for meditation and the royal family as a retreat. The island was also home to the estate of the Minister of Cultural Affairs, along with the aforementioned Situng Harbour, which was located on the northern end of the island. The island was likely home to dragons in early history, but when humanity arrived on Cantha, it was the Tengu, an avian humanoid species which held the mountainous regions of the territory, more specifically on Shing Jea, the militaristic Santali tribe. The mass migration of humanity to Shing Jea, predominantly farmers after the Jade Wind catastrophe, sparked a protracted and bloody war between the two species, not just on the island but throughout Cantha, which history would remember as the Tengu Wars. Though peace was won with the Angchu Tengu of the mainland, the Santali tribe remained on a war footing with not just humanity, but their Angchu cousins too. The unpopulated eastern province of the islands, specifically the Zen Dejun area, was a holy place of pilgrimage and was home to the venerated Zun Ra. These enigmatic spirit beings offered aid and protection to both travelers and the land itself in the corporeal form of the Kirin. Now, Kirin are found in various locations throughout Cantha and resemble, well, quadrupedal seahorse is the best description I can come up with. Now, during the factions campaign, all but the celestial Kirin were corrupted. Arenanet's first piece of concept art for the new expansion is of Shing Jea, and I can understand why. It was the prime hub for foreign commerce as well as a spiritual nexus for the empire. It was also the centre of academic study for player professions too, with schools for each of the disciplines, so exploring that aspects of the island could open up a new avenue to elite specializations in the upcoming expansion. Who knows what secrets and skills the Canthan scholars have learnt over the last 250 years. Also, for visual spectacle and diversity, the island, being rooted in spirituality and farming, could offer a juxtaposition to the urban sprawl of splendour and squalor once found in the imperial city of Kaineng. Now, that is of course assuming that the vast capital city of the Dragon Empire still remains. I mean, content and feature-wise, I think the Kurin could well be a potential template from which the art team develops the expansions, new mounts maybe, and perhaps even a new tameable species for rangers to add to the menagerie of wondrous combat companions. Shing Jea could well be the inspiration for a new elite specialization, and I want the monk. I would love to see the return of a direct healing profession, and the monk was the master healer back in the day, and squishy as all hell. On that note, I think the ethos of the monk would fit the light-wielding guardian best. The profession already has a vast arsenal of weapons to choose from, but perhaps the warhorn is the most thematic of the very few that it doesn't already have access to. In gear terms, we could see an updated version of the Shing Jea armour sets of old, which had unique designs for each of the primary professions, with, an arsenal of weapons, all sharing that same aesthetic. If the Tengu have reclaimed some of the island, a Santali set might be the order of the day, weapons to match. If we are getting a new playable race for the expansion, a fan favourite would of course be the Tengu. Yeah, this island could act as a new starting area for Tengu players. The story could read something like, we start life as a Santali Tengu, but we question the warlike stance of our tribe and are exiled from the nation. We choose to sail across the clashing sea, headed to the Dominion of Winds, which would be a very welcome core map addition to any Canthan expansion. This area has long been locked off for exploration, and it could offer a bridging narrative to Cantha, not just for new Tengu players who could easily hail from the Dominion itself, but for all players as the Dominion opens its doors to the world and leads us to the Dragon Continent. Now, I know it will be challenging to fit a new race in. 7 years of story for Guild Wars 2, it's a lot, but I hope it is possible, and I think it would be a big draw for new and old players alike. To say Kaineng City was vast truly understates its scale. It was a sprawling megametropolis which engulfed a third of the continent of Cantha. From the affluent and ancient Kaineng centre to the slums of Shing Jea, the city was a manifestation of the deep inequality festering at the heart of the empire. The city was home to the imperial palace, residence of the emperor and his government, known as the Celestial Ministry, as well as a Tanaki temple, which housed the souls of Canthan's most venerated heroes. There were, of course, the commercial and residential areas of varying degrees of wealth and size, but the bulk of the city was made up of shanty towns, towering, precarious wooden high-rises where street gangs terrorized the poor as the Imperial Guard looked on in indifference. The city was not always so. Before the Jade Wind, the Kaineng Center and the temple palaces surrounding it were the Imperial City. Then came the winds that devastated all life in its wake. The forest, the farmlands, and even the waters were petrified. The surviving population fled to the coasts and into the mountains, hence the wars. And the emperor opened the doors to the city, welcoming in his people, giving them shelter and protection. In the years that followed, the population exploded and inequality soared. In Factions, players explore not just the surface of the city, but the maze of its sewers and underground structures too. The city was truly a rabbit warren of hidden tunnels and passages below and above ground. And like all big cities, Kaineng had an insect problem, a very large one that took the form of mantids and not just the, cute rollery type, unfortunately. Another interesting denizen of the city were the stone guardians of Tenakai Temple. Gigantic magical things that they were. In essence, these beings are similar to elementals found in the wilds or summoned by elementalists, but the temple guardians were fashioned after the ancient imperial guard lions of Asian culture. These noble stone puppies, again, would be wonderful as mounts. You'd have to shrink them a bit. Who doesn't want a giant puppy? Now, it is inconceivable that Kaineng could or would be left out of any new Canthan expansion. Its awesome scale alone almost guarantees that we will find ourselves exploring this gigantic metropolis, be it, hiking through the lost splendor of its ruins or strolling through the vibrant streets and marveling at the grandeur of its imperial palace and gardens. Now, the power of the imperial throne could, have waned in the years since, although after the last recorded emperor, who was a totalitarian monster, I don't know. I mean, the damage a cruel, stupid, and covetous leader can inflict upon a nation, sans outside influence, can be catastrophic alone. So what culture will find there is deeply questionable. And of course, the dragon rising is in full swing, and with 3 elder dragons still standing, any number of disasters could have befallen this once great city. The ancient art and architecture of the city are a wondrous source of inspiration for the art team to bring to life all manner of imperial armaments and attire, from the highly ornate armours of the royal court to the basic, more utilitarian kit of the common guardsman, and it's a big city, big corruption, the uniforms and emblems of the organised crime syndicates which once dominated the slums of Kaineng, although apparently they were wiped out, but crime never seems to go away. So this is a rich, varied tapestry of culture and class to harvest ideas from, so expect a lot of wondrous and beautiful things. But I do caution that the influence of Yusoku and the Ministry of Purity, brought in by the winds of change, their influence cannot be understated, so who knows what we're going to get. Bordering the capital city to the south is Echovald Forest and the Jade Sea, once home to the Kurzicks and Luxon factions, with Echovald Forest being home to the Kurzick and the Jade Sea to the Luxons. Echovald Forest, before the Jade Winds, was a majestic living temple of nature, with trees as tall as the great redwoods of California, teeming with all manner of life. When the catastrophe swept over the lands, nothing was left but crystalline shells, beautiful, silent, and entirely bereft of life, or so it would seem. Those Kurzicks who survived refused to abandon their woodland home, carving their new dwellings from the petrified forest, cultivating a new way of life beneath its frozen canopy. The aesthetics of the Kurzick outposts and hubs was distinctly European in a medieval Gothic style, setting it starkly apart from the ancient Asian echoes seen in Shing Jea and Kaineng. Now, the Kurzicks are a deeply devout people, dedicating themselves to the worship of the then 5 recognized gods, and their social structure reflected their faith. Their society consisted of 5 great houses, 1 for each of the old gods. Each house had cultivated a different field of specialization, which reflected the aspects of the god that was their patron. House Zuheltz's patron was Duena, and within their house they had fostered great magical healing skills, wards of protection, and were the masters of stone shaping. House Vasberg produced the greatest warriors of the Kurzick nation. Violence was their way of life, and of course, Balthazar was their patron. House Durheim embraced the past, being the keepers of Kurzick history and that of Greater Cantha. They also studied and recorded the genealogies of their people. This devotion to the dead was said to grant them the ability to chronicle the life of every Kurzick ever born, this gifted to them by Grenth. House Borer were the visual artists of Kurzick society, creating masterpieces in sculpture and paint. They sought to bring beauty and colour back to their forest home in the name of Lissa. House Ludgardis, under their patron Melandru, brought life back to the forest through music. They also served in the imperial court, where Ludgardis instruments and musicians were revered. One of the house's primary functions was to nurture the few living trees that remained after the Jade winds. When we last stepped foot in Echovald forest, life had begun to return. Sadly, it was not always such a peaceful land, as the seemingly unending conflict between the Kurzicks and the Luxons smouldered on, century after century. From border skirmishes to full-scale war, the friction between these two factions gave rise to the name of the original Canthan Expansion. Unless we travel to an entirely new area of Cantha, far, far to the south of the original maps, it's honestly hard to imagine an expansion without this forest. I would love to see this once frozen forest reimagined. Guild Wars 2 is one of the most beautiful games I have ever had the pleasure to play, and I look forward to exploring these deep, dark woods. How much is Jade still? It's going to be interesting. Now, I think the Kurzick houses could be used to great effect in any expansion, but because there is no indication of the narrative thus far, it would be hard to speculate as to what function they could fulfill. We could see new elite specializations arrive from the houses with their different disciplines. I know many players have wanted a bard profession for a long time, me included, and House Ludgardis could ably offer a narrative sort of imperative for that. Another interesting inhabitant of Echovald were the Wardens. These ancient protectors of the forest turned hostile towards humanity after the Jade Winds and committed themselves to the restoration of Echovald Forest, seeking any means to undo the damage that Shira wrought. The origins of these beings are unknown, but many speculate that they were once powerful druids or holy men, perhaps changed by the winds themselves to their current form. With the second defeat of Shiro and life returning to the forest, I wonder what has become of the Wardens. Other hostile beings in the forest were the Dread and corrupted Kirin and corrupted Stone Guardians, along with the more mysterious and deadly Unai. Actually, Unai are everywhere in Cantha, but in the forest as well, who were believed to be humans corrupted by the affliction propagated by Shiro's spirit. Now, the last interesting oddity I want to talk about in Echovald were the forever trees that were found in the Eternal Grove. To date, we have knowledge of only 3 of these strange arboreals in existence. The Kurzicks use these trees to create juggernauts. So a living human volunteered to participate in a ceremony of awakening and were transformed into a hulking plant construct. The transformed human retained their mind and memories, and anyone undertaking this rite lived as long as the tree who gave them their new form, which could effectively grant that person immortality. Even when struck down in battle, if the juggernaut is returned to the tree that bore it, they will be revived. So it's not an insignificant weapon, and something which could be explored, or perhaps even explained with a bit of a Sylvari interaction. So there are lots of threads the story team could pull from Echovald Forest and its inhabitants, but despite how much I've chatted about it, there is still much more to tell. However, where the story leads us into Cantha depends not only on the outcome of the Icebrood saga narrative, but on the fate of this unique people and their culture. In the 250 years since we were here, much has changed. Even just 50 years after the events of factions, the Kurzicks lost all of their hard-won independence from the imperial throne. In fact, how much of Echovald will be petrified after hundreds of years of regrowth is unknown, assuming that continued. And I wonder what effect the reawakening of life in the forest will have on the Kurzicks' culture, if indeed they still reside in the forest itself. The final area we will be covering today is the Jade Sea, the last area that we got to explore in the expansion, which was literally a sea of solid jade, the waters having been petrified like the forests of Echovald. The Jade Sea was held in factions by the Luxon armadas, and it was a stunning place to explore and quest in. Beautiful, bright, colourful and open, in great contrast to the dark, oppressive, gothic vibe of Echovald Forest. Lovely, but, it's nice to walk in the sunshine. Now, the Jade Sea was home to numerous aquatic beasties who had adapted to life above the waves. Kraken spawn, creeping carp, kappa, and leviathan claw giant crabs, to name but a few of the unique creatures found in this region. Now, the epicenter of the Jade Winds was also found in the Jade Sea, the Harvest Temple, where Shiro Togachi murdered the Emperor Angxiang, and where he was himself murdered, killed by three great heroes of Cantha, the Kurzick Saint Victus, the Luxon Archimuris, with the aid of the assassin Vizier. At this location, players battle the Saltspray dragon Kuunavang, which had been corrupted by Shiro, cleansed by the Ascalonian heroes of old, yay, the Goas. The dragon becomes one of the few non-hostile dragon NPCs in the whole of the original game, along with Glint, her offspring, who would become known as Vlast, and the two other uncorrupted Saltspray dragons, which is Albax and an unnamed dragon hatchling. So before the Jade Winds, this area was an inland sea, and the Luxons were seafaring, nomadic and fragmented. Trade and fishing and even piracy were their traditional professions, but unlike the Crimson Skull pirates that terrorized the sea around Shing Jea Island, Luxon raiders looted cargo only and took great care over the safety of civilians caught up in their business transactions. Now, they were never a devout people, although many worshipped Grenth and Balthasar and even Lissa, but in truth they venerated strength above all. And after the Jade Winds, it was that strength which saw them through and allowed them to reimagine their society from seafaring nomads into the three clans found in factions, helped, of course, by their collective hatred of the Kurzicks and a monstrous emperor. Now, the three clans were the Turtle, Crab, and Serpent, each led by a captain. The Turtle was the largest of the three, boasting the fiercest warriors, the most destructive magics, and They were the breeders of the mammoth siege turtles that they rode into battle and sometimes lived on. Amazing creatures. Hope they come back into the game. Now, Crab Clan were the masters of jade farming and were able to find and harvest the rarest, most magically concentrated veins of jade. The clan crossed the Jade Sea in giant leviathans, fortified land ships, which were used in battle with the Kurzicks, of course, as well as for industry. But it was the Serpent Clan and their engineers who first created the leviathans, converting their once sea-bound ships for land use. The mechanical mastery of these vessels rivals that of the Asura and the Jar even today. Now, many scholars have speculated that the Luxons may well have originated from the Crystal Sea, now desert, and perhaps they were even the descendants of the legendary Magonites, who thankfully escaped across the Shing Sea before they could be transformed by Abaddon into demonic immortal servants. Now, personally, I would love to ride across what is left of the Jade Sea on a Luxon Leviathan. They could even spawn a new game mode of vehicle combat. Of course, they could make mounts, player housing even. But as with Echovald, after Shiro was defeated, the frozen waters of the Jade Sea began to melt, returning to water again. So could the whole of Cantha be free of jade by now? I don't know. We'll have to see. And again, let's be clear, what remains of Luxon and Kurzick culture and tradition is very open for question. 50 years after the events of faction, Yuzoku took the throne. He waged war on both factions, dragging them back under the iron fist of his imperial rule. Perhaps some Luxons fled the empire, returning to the ocean. It could be these seafarers who land on the shores of Tyria, calling us across the ocean to new adventure in Cantha. Let's hope there are still turtle tanks and leviathans because, well, that's going to be on my wish list for all expansions ever. And of course, along with faction-specific armors and weapons and elite specializations born out of these two warring sects. A new Turtle Master Ranger sounds quite fun to me. So finally we come to the end. That's my not so TLDR breakdown of the old Canthan explorable areas and the Kurzicks and the Luxons in a little bit more detail. There is so much more to say about these locations and people, but this video is already tediously long, so I will end here. Please do like this video if indeed you did. Share it if you know somebody who would be interested in it. Subscribe and ring that bell if you think I've earned it, and please do show some love to Cody, Kildare, Cobb, Molini, Jolly Joe Star, Dark Griever, and all my wondrous, fantabulous Patreons, without whom I will be unable to dedicate the time and resources I do to my channel. I can never thank you all enough. If you'd like to join them, links to my Patreon page below. And if you're feeling inspired and want to jump into Guild Wars 2, there are referral links below to the free-to-play game and the Path of Fire expansion, which now includes all the content from the Heart of Thorns expansion as well. Thanks to the generosity of Arenanet and their partner program, of whom I am a proud affiliate. Using any of these referral links directly supports my channel, but costs you not a penny more. Now, I hope you will come back and join me again very soon. There is a factions lore breakdown. There will be steel and fire content coming as well. But until then, as always, thank you so much for watching.